My name is Loredana Gwitch-Wyatt, and I'm the Managing Director of STEPS Charity Worldwide. And I'm pleased today to have here with us again, Professor Dan Perry. Dan, thank you, and over to you.
Thanks very much. So I am Dan Perry. I'm a kids orthopaedic surgeon, and I work at Alder Children's Hospital. And I've got a funny life because a lot of my life is research, mainly researching children's orthopaedic disease, of which Perthes disease is the kind of big one for me. And I spend the rest of my time doing surgery, and that is mainly treating children with Perthes disease and hip dysplasia. So I'm guessing you're all here because you're all familiar in your own way with this disease. And so this is a normal hip joint. The hip joint's very tall, and it's nice and round. It's like a football shape. And on this side, the top of the football is very squished and it's out of place. And so this is very typical Perthes disease, and this is what you guys are experiencing in a very different way to how I experience it. You're getting all the trouble with it, and you're at home at the moment. So hopefully I can try and alleviate some of your fears and explain to you about what I understand about Perthes disease. So my guess is that your child is probably a male, and I say that because for every 4 boys affected for Perthes disease, there's 1 girl. Usually they're boys between the age of about 4 and 8 years old. That's when it typically starts. In girls, the girls are a little bit older when it starts. The girls are a little bit younger when it starts. This is the reason why we think Perthes happens. So this is the hip bone. So this is like the X-ray, but this shows us all the blood vessels that are within the hip. And to the top of the hip bone, between about the age of 4 and 8 years old, there's a single blood vessel. And this single blood vessel comes up and supplies food to the top of the hip joint. And we think for some reason this blood vessel gets blocked off. And because it gets blocked off, the top of the hip joint can't get any food anymore. And because it can't get any food, it loses the hard bone within it, and it becomes all squishy. And that's essentially what happens in Perthes disease. This top bit loses its blood supply, the bone dies, if you like, so the bone disappears, and over the course of time it comes back to life. So more blood vessels recognize that this one's gone, and more blood vessels come from within the edge to supply more blood to the hip joint. Oops. So this is where Perthes disease happens in the UK. So this is a study we did using some GP data, and we can see there's loads of Perthes disease the further north you go in the UK. And so Scotland's got way more than anything down south. That's not to say it doesn't happen all over the UK, but it's interesting that there's a very strong latitude gradient. So the further north you go in the UK, the more Perthes disease you get. And it's also interesting that although you guys are all suffering the effects of Perthes disease, it's actually a disease that's in decline. So we know that over the last 30 years or so, the rates of Perthes disease have dramatically fallen. In Liverpool in the 1990s, about 1 in 700 kids got Perthes disease. And if we fast forward to today, that's more like about 1 in 1,500 kids get Perthes disease at some point during their life. So Colin Bruce, who's my mentor, who trained me when I was a junior surgeon, he used to teach me that kids with Perthes disease he used to teach me to think of them a little bit like Bart Simpson, because they're often a bit shorter than their peers. And so my patients often tell me that their child is the shortest kids in the class. And they also tend to be a bit hyperactive, so they're often all over the place. And they're a little bit wiry. So children tend to be skinny and short for their age. And that's the typical Perthes disease sort of picture that we see. And that whole hyperactivity thing, people ask me, is it hyperactivity that causes Perthes disease, or is it Perthes disease that makes them hyperactive? And that's a bit chicken and egg. I don't really know the answer to that, but all I can say is that kids with Perthes disease generally are a bit more active than normal children, well, other children. And we've explored that in some research studies where we've demonstrated that. So who gets Perthes disease? Well, the old adage for children who get Perthes disease was short and hyperactive, and we've demonstrated that in what the shortness was demonstrated very, very nicely in the late 1970s by a chap who's been very good to me over the years called Peter Dangerfield, and he demonstrated nicely, measuring hundreds of children with Perthes disease and hundreds of children without Perthes disease, that they were a bit shorter. Interestingly, he also demonstrated their feet were a little bit shorter than they should be, even relative to their trunk size. And just before they're diagnosed with Perthes disease, often their feet don't grow for a couple of years beforehand, or don't grow as fast as they should, which is kind of interesting. There's people also talk about genitourinary abnormalities, so problems with the development of their of people's testicles or hernias in the nether regions. And people have also spoken about hyperactivity, and we've demonstrated the link with hyperactivity. What often gets asked of me by my patients is it genetic? And so to answer the question whether it's genetic, we looked at something called the Danish Twin Registry. This is the funniest slide I've got, because it always makes me chuckle. So the Danish Twin Registry. So we've got two Danish pastries, and in the Danish Twin Registry, if you've got identical twins, then they've got the same pastry and living in the same environment. And if they're non-identical twins, they've got just half the same genes, but the same environment. And what we looking at the Danish Twin Registry is we looked at 81 sets of twins for at least one who've got Perthes disease. And what we could tell from that is there was no evidence of a heritable component, so no evidence of a genetic component of Perthes disease. So identical twins didn't have higher rates of Perthes disease. So identical twins didn't have higher rates of them both being affected by Perthes disease. But there was some evidence of family clustering. So what does that mean? Well, it means that occasionally a brother or two brothers or a brother and sister may both have Perthes disease, but that doesn't necessarily have to be genetic. It can also happen because they're both exposed to something. So if at home there's a factor which is triggering or causing Perthes disease, and we don't know what that is, but it's almost something, or certainly something which is in the environment around us that's causing Perthes disease, or at least triggering Perthes disease. And what we can see from this and a few other studies now is that there's almost certainly something that they're exposed to, which families are all likely equally to exposed to, that's triggering and starting this Perthes disease process. But it's almost certainly not genetic. So one of the things that keeps coming up, and I know that Loredana's had a few questions about this, is about the stages of Perthes disease. And so Perthes disease always goes through a number of different stages. And when we first see it, it's often in these it's either in stage A or B, which is the initial stage or the sclerosis stage. So in the initial stage, there's not a great deal to see on the x-rays. That the changes are often quite subtle. And often doctors may indeed say that they can't see anything wrong with your child's hip. And perhaps if your child continues to have pain, someone may do an MR scan, which identifies Perthes disease. And so this is the initial stage, and there's not much to find on the x-rays. In the sclerosis stage, which is the next stage along, the top of the hip bone becomes very white, and it's become very white because it's what we call sclerotic. So it's white because the bone here has died, and the bone here has died, and it's lost, because it's died, it's less strong. So it's lost its structural integrity, and that causes the bone to flatten. And you can see there's this flattening on the top of the hip, which we call coxoplanar. After the bone's died, the body then eats it away. The body knows that bone shouldn't be there because it's dead and not very good. So what happens is new blood vessels come in to supply the hip, and they come in from the edges. And their job, firstly, is to eat away the dead bone. And their job, secondly, is to put new bone back down. And so firstly, they eat away the dead bone. And when they eat away the dead bone, you can see patches of bone missing, and you still see some patches of this kind of deep white bone. And you also might see some patches of what look like new bone forming, so kind of patchy cotton woolly bone at the edges. And then in the last stage, it's the reossification stage. So all that dead, deep white bone's been eaten away, and it's eaten away, and it's left this big hole in the middle where it's eaten away all the dead stuff. But what you can see is that lots of new bone, which is a normal colour, is around the edges. So if you imagine that the new blood vessels, when they come from all around the edges. So what happens is they start eating away the bones at the edges, and then they start laying new bone down. So the last bit to get sorted is that central bit in the middle. And that's why this central bit here is always the last bit to reossify. So if I see this in a new child, which we do occasionally, I'll know that this child's in the last stage of Perthes disease and they're in the reossification stage. In these two stages, in stage A and B, the bone's quite soft. So they're both bones soft and squidgy. And that's the time that I can talk to you about what we might need to do or what we might consider doing in these hips. In stage C and D, the bone's not squidgy, it's gone hard again. And so it's very difficult to influence the squidginess once it's gone hard. And so this, if we're going to talk about treatment, then these are the stages we talk about treatment. So stage A or B, or well, actually in fragmentation as well, but kind of earlier fragmentation. But once it's certainly in this stage, it's hard and we can't change it. It's going to regrow. I keep jumping. So this is where we get into the difficulties, and this is where you guys at home will struggle, because the treatments of Perthes disease are wide and varied. And often the big problem is that some of the treatments are almost exactly the opposite of each other. And this goes to show the degree of uncertainty and the degree of and the lack of consensus that currently exists within children's orthopaedics about the best way to manage this disease. Very broadly, about half of surgeons in the UK, and indeed half of surgeons around the world, don't really believe that surgery makes a considerable difference to the treatment of Perthes disease. And that's a very sweeping statement, but that's a kind of a generalization. And broadly, the other half of surgeons believe that surgery makes some difference to making the hip a better shape in the long term. And there's these two broad approaches, one for no surgery and one for surgery. And that's where our big uncertainty lies. And which treatment you're offered will very much depend on the philosophy of the surgeon. But really, they should be able to explain both treatments to you. And so we talked about this, and this is one analogy of it. This is an ice cream. And so the ice cream is the top of this hip joint. And this is our freezer cable. This blood vessel is our freezer cable. So if we turn off this freezer cable, then our ice cream melts. And because our ice cream melts, it goes and it changes shape, and it changes and squashes into whatever shape it's pushed into. And so if our hip starts to escape, and if it starts to escape from the edge of the socket, our soft ice cream can squidge under the load of the edge of this socket. So our ice creams can squidge out of this nice ice cream mold that's here, which is the socket. If it squidges out, it will change shape and form a different shape to what it should. So it should be a nice football shape, and it might become a rugby ball shape, or even worse, some sort of horrible shape with a big saddle here. And ideally, what we want is a nice hip living in a nice socket, a nice round hip and a nice socket, because that's what's going to give us the least pain and the least problems in the long term. And the more not round it is, the more problems it's going to, or it's likely to lead to, in terms of pain and the development of early arthritis. So the old treatment for Perthes disease, which you'll be pleased to know we don't do anymore, was to treat children in bed in a hospital for 2 years. And this photo was sent to me by this chap here, who was in a photo. This was a hospital somewhere in Yorkshire, and so the boys were sent to hospital for 2 years, and they were taken out in the sunny days, and they were believed that air was good for them. So that's why a lot of the old orthopaedics hospitals are in the middle of the countryside, because it was believed that air was good for Perthes disease and TB. But you'll be pleased that we don't do that anymore, and we don't take your children off you for 2 years. Well, you'll be pleased for some of the time at least. Sometime I'm sure you wish that you could give your children for someone for 2 years, but at least that perhaps is just me. But anyway, so these are the other treatments that you may encounter. So Some people use braces or calipers to treat Perthes disease. This is done very uncommonly, I believe, in the UK, but certainly around the world, this is still common in practice. Some people will do an osteotomy, so break the bone and reposition the bone. And this is called a varus osteotomy, where we take a hip that's a bit like this, we break it across here to force the hip down into this position. Or the other option is to do some sort of work on the pelvis, so do a pelvic osteotomy, so break the pelvis bone, so to either try and move the socket so it covers the hip up more in a number of different directions. And this is one that I did earlier. This is a varus osteotomy, and so the idea with a varus osteotomy is you tuck the edge of the socket inside the edge of the hip inside the socket. So as the hip regrows, it regrows in a nice round shape, and eventually you get a nice hip that's a nice round shape. And this is a different one I did. This is called a shelf osteotomy, where we build something onto the edge of the socket to try and again contain that hip and stop it squashing outwards. And as it regrows in a nice shape. This isn't quite round, it's a bit more rugby ball shape than a football shape, but still a good hip. So the difficulty and the challenge that we've got in interpreting what to do and whether surgery is better than no surgery is that the studies we've got are really, really not good. And they're not good because they're not high quality studies, and therefore surgeons, along with, in partnership with you, have to make decisions about the evidence available. And this is the study that everyone refers to, and this is called the Herring study. And it was done by a chap called Tony Herring in Dallas. And it's not a high quality study, it's what's called a cohort study, where we looked at lots of different children over time. And what we could see, so this is the best hip shape, and this is the worst hip shape, and these are the hip shapes in the middle. So these are football shapes, these are rugby ball shapes, and these are weird shapes. And so if we do surgery, then we end up with slightly more children in this best hip shape group, and slightly less children in this worst hip shape group. And if we don't do surgery, you can see it's slightly less in this group and slightly more in this group. But these differences aren't huge. This surgery isn't a groundbreaking surgery that's going to change the world. It's the differences are marginal at best. And also on the basis that this study was a little bit ropey, this is the best we've got to hang our hats on. But I don't believe I don't believe there's any really good, strong evidence to tell us either way at the moment. So that's why we surgeons are all in a state of unease, because we're all not sure what the best way to treat your children is. So what we tend to do is to go with the way that historically our units practiced. And at Alder, where I work, we tend to do surgery on these children because we've got a big cohort of children with about 1,500 kids in there now, who generally we believe do better with surgery than without surgery. However, we don't have strong evidence. So my questions, and it's the same as yours, my question is, does surgery help? And I don't know the answer to that. And to some extent, what we need to do is to do a study where we fairly allocate children between surgery and no surgery, which is called a trial. And I run quite a lot of these trials now in different aspects of children's orthopaedic surgery, so usually trauma. But what I really need is support from parents and children and surgeons to try and do this in Perthes disease. And this is a really big ask, because we'll be asking the computer to decide fairly whether a child gets surgery or no surgery. And one of the big questions that I've got is, how much better does surgery have to be to recommend it to everyone? So we could see before that this study said that surgery was slightly better than no surgery, but this difference wasn't huge. And so this may be big enough for you, but I'm not sure whether this difference is big enough to justify doing surgery with all the risks of surgery and the second surgery to remove whatever metalwork we put in order to justify that. So that's what goes through my head, and that's what I'm planning at the moment. So I've got an NIHR, National Institute for Health Research Professorship, trying to answer the big questions in Perthes disease at the moment, or at least what I perceive is the big question in Perthes disease, which is around whether we should or shouldn't do surgery. And we've also got a study which is just about to report, and I need to show the results to the surgeons before I do other people, which has got some further evidence looking at whether surgery is or isn't helpful. And that's the BOSS study, and some of you may have been involved in that. So that's kind of the crux of what I know about Perthes disease. I hope that was helpful. I'm really, really happy to answer all of your questions.
Thank you very much, Dan. I have already questions that have been submitted. So let me go through the first one. This is related to how do you relieve pain when the surgeon effectively, the consultant does not believe in surgery. So how do you deal with the pain of the child? How do you manage pain?
So the challenge is that surgery doesn't, I guess there's two parts to that. So the first part is around the surgery. So even if we did surgery for Perthes disease, the surgery doesn't take away the Perthes disease. Perthes disease from start to finish takes about 3 years in order to heal. So the bone dies and the new bone has to reform, and throughout that whole process, that hip can be sore. And all surgery does is it just changes the position of the hip. So we start with, I've stolen my children's Play-Doh. So we end up with so we have a hip that's slightly escaping, and as it escapes, the edge of the socket digs into the hip and creates this kind of weird shape in the hip. And we don't want that to happen. So what we do, I'll fix the Play-Doh. What we do is that we either bend the socket over to cover the hip up completely so the edge of it can't dig in, or we bend the hip over in order to tuck that within the socket so the edge of the socket can't dig in. But the enemy is this edge of the socket digging in and creating a weird shape in the hip, because that hip isn't going to work like a football anymore. But the Perthes disease itself causes pain, and irrespective of what we do, the kid's still going to have pain. So surgery doesn't change that. In terms of managing the pain, the best we can do is simple analgesics, and that's usually paracetamol, codeine, and then other things that parents often find helpful is hot blankets or those things that you put in the microwave to kind of put heat packs on the child. And those are the things that often make a difference. But that first year with Perthes disease is really troublesome, and that's the troublesome year. And what you need to, what the reassurance I can give you as a parent is everyone tells me that first year is horrible. I see a new case of Perthes disease every week on average in Liverpool, and I always tell parents that it's that first year is the bad time, and then over the course of the next few years, it's just going to gradually get better and better. And often, just when you think it's got better, often it takes a step back and gets worse again for a few weeks. And hey, that's just, that's the process of Perthes disease. And that's the process of a lot of disease and a lot of problems, isn't it, along the way. But on the whole, you'll start at a point here, and over the course of 3 years, it's going to get much, much better.
Thank you. And linked to that question is a mother asking if they, therefore, through the 3-year period, should a child not be active? So what does a consultant, or what should we recommend a child to do during those 3 years?
So that's really tough, and that very much depends on your surgeon and how your surgeon treats you and believes you should be treated. So I worked in Toronto for a bit, and when I worked in Toronto, I remember one of the children was treated in a wheelchair for 2 years, which for me that doesn't really work. That's not really how I'd like to treat the children we treat. But different surgeons have different philosophies about how much weight people should put through the hip. For me, I recommend children avoid bouncy castles and trampolines, and beyond that, life is normal. Because as a parent, and I've got 2 of them, when you turn your back, that kid will be jumping off the sofa, or in the worst place that you can possibly imagine anyway. So trying to restrict normal life is just tough, and it's kind of mentally tough on the child as well. So I recommend people do the easy things. So take the trampoline away, don't go to bouncy castle parties, which I feel guilty enough about as a parent. But beyond that, life is normal.
Thank you very much. And there are a few questions related to long-term consequences of Perthes disease. What are the long-term consequences of Perthes disease? For example, is there osteoarthritis or arthritis that could develop?
Yeah, so there is a, where's my hips? I had a hip collection before. Oh, this is it. I've got it in my hand. So this hip, if we take this off, this is actually 3D printed hip of a child who did have Perthes disease, or rather has Perthes disease. And so this is a normal hip, and a normal hip's a nice round football shape, and this is the Perthes disease hip, and this is a real one from a CT scan. So we've printed this out, and what we can see is the two hips are very different. One hip is very, very flat, and you can imagine that a normal hip in the socket glides around really, really clearly and really easily. Whereas when this hip fits in the socket, it kind of it doesn't move as well. It grinds, and you could probably hear it grinding. And that's what happens in real life. And so as it grinds, it wears away the socket and it wears away the top of the joint. And so if we've got a hip that's ended up like this, if we're completely honest, there's not a great deal of options to make that hip better once it's got like this, other than to take the hip away. We're fortunate in that a hip replacement is the best or the second best operation that surgeons do after cataracts. So the World Health Organization said that there's two operations which really, really, really change a person's quality of life. And the first one's cataracts, and the second one's hip replacement, because it's such a reliable surgery at taking away pain. So I know Perthes disease is a horrible thing, and I see it firsthand all of the time. But the other thing we have to be reassured by is, at least if the worst case scenario happens and we end up with a really nasty hip, that there is a get out of jail card, which isn't perfect, but it's as close to perfect as we in medicine can make it.
Thank you, Dan. And with regards to early diagnosis, how long does it take for a child to be diagnosed with Perthes disease in the UK?
Yeah, so that depends on how they present. So usually by the time people come to see me, that they've usually had Perthes disease for a few months, and at least a few months, and they may have had kind of pain in their knee or pain in their hip and seen their doctor, and their doctor's put it down to be a sprain initially, and then they'll go and get an x-ray, and we saw that on that x-ray beforehand, the x-rays may initially be normal, and that pain may persist for a little bit longer, and then someone either gets an MRI scan or gets a further x-ray, and that further x-ray may have changed because it may have moved from that stage A to stage B, and it may be a lot more obvious at that stage. So it can take a wee while to get that first diagnosis. But that initial period to make the diagnosis, as long as as long as it's not kind of a couple of years, we haven't missed anything. So we're still in that early stage where we can potentially talk about surgery if that's the way that you as a parent and me as a surgeon think is the correct option.
And with regards to hip replacement, when is the right time to have a hip replacement?
Sure, and that's really tough. So there's so ultimately the right time to have a hip replacement is when the pain is interfering with life, when the person can't sleep, and when the hip is fully mature. So we can't do a hip replacement until at least 15 or 16 years old. But if we were going to do it at 15 or 16 years old, that person would have to be desperate. So their pain would have to be awful, their quality of life would have to be awful. And some people, some surgeons may have told you that it's just not possible until someone's 40 or 50 years old. But increasingly it is done at a younger age. And I can think of 2 patients recently at Alder, where we've done hip replacements on children who've had Perthes disease. And it really does change their life, and it gives them their whole life back. But we'd only do it if the pain was terrible, if the quality of life was terrible, and if the x-rays looked terrible. And we'd be very clear that, look, we're doing this because we know it's going to give you benefit now, but we're not sure what the future holds, because most of the evidence in hip replacements is all from 50-year-olds and 60-year-olds. And so we're giving this to you, but in 10 or 20 years, you may need more surgery. This isn't likely to be the answer for life. But having said all of that, hip replacements are way better than they used to be. And for some people, it may be the answer for a very, very long time.
And an interesting question has come in with regards to when doing the physical examination of a child that potentially has Perthes disease. What would you look for, or what are common denominators, let's say, when looking for at a child that has Perthes disease?
So the only thing I care about, I care about a lot, but the only thing I care about in the examination is stiffness. And so I look to see if the child's stiff, and I look at that because that's the only thing that guides my treatment. And we come back to my models, because I like my models. So if we've got a hip that's moving, then my soft ice cream all the time is moving within my ice cream cone, and life is good. So all the time this hip is going to, if it's moving without any stiffness, it's going to stay in a nice round shape, even though the top of it's squashy. If the hip becomes very stiff, then this is the time that the hip's starting to escape, and this is the time that the top of it's going to dig into this bit. And that's when I worry. So my reason to do surgery is for stiffness. So if a child comes to me and is stiff, and I see them again at 6 weeks later and they're still stiff, that's when I do surgery to contain that hip. So either to tuck the hip in or to move the socket over. And so X-rays are only useful in making the diagnosis, and MRI scans are only useful in making the diagnosis. They don't actually change what I do. The only thing that changes what I do in my practice is the examination, is whether the child's stiff or not stiff. And it's usually binary, so they either are or they aren't stiff, and that's because of inflammation within the joint. We're saying, is the joint inflamed or is it not inflamed?
And I guess there's an interesting question that has come in terms of early diagnosis, whether it is Perthes usually is detected at GP level, or whether usually is referred to an orthopedic consultant to be diagnosed.
Yes, so some GPs may send a child away for X-rays, and that X-ray so the X-rays are reported by a radiologist in the UK. So an X-ray doctor looks at each X-ray that's taken, and they may say there's Perthes disease, and then invariably the GP would refer to an orthopaedic consultant to look at that. We have to remember that so Perthes disease affects about 1 in 1,500 kids in the UK. So most GPs will only see it a few times in their career. So it's a rare diagnosis for a GP to make. And similarly, most orthopedic surgeons won't have a huge experience in managing Perthes disease. So the only people that have got a lot of experience is children's orthopedic surgeons, and if we looked back at the graph, it's mainly children's orthopedic surgeons in certain areas of the UK where there's more Perthes disease, but certainly the ones at the big children's hospitals.
With regards to Perthes disease, and we talked about this the previous webinar, is it in adulthood it's not called Perthes disease, because in adulthood it obviously Perthes disease has occurred, and I guess it's what would be the symptoms for an adult, I guess, having Perthes disease that has not been treated?
Yeah, so in adults, so Perthes disease causes the shaped hip. But the trouble is that there's a few other conditions as well in childhood which will cause a hip that's this shape. And so infection might do this, or a condition called slip epiphysis may create a slightly different shaped hip, or hip dysplasia may change the shape of the hip. So there's a few different conditions which change the shape of the hip. And adult orthopedic surgeons are very simple. I can say that because I'm a kid's orthopedic surgeon. So adult orthopedic surgeons are very simple. To them, on the whole, that they look at the shape of the hip, but generally it's either got arthritis or it hasn't got arthritis. And if it's got arthritis, then their treatment is to take away the hip joint. So that's why the Perthes disease itself is that initial period where the bone's still growing, but once it's grown and that growth plate's disappeared, then we tend to group all of the misshapen hips all together, and the adult surgeons treat them kind of accordingly. but because it's much easier to group them all together then. Sorry, I may have missed the rest of the question.
No, what would be the symptoms of
symptoms are the same as
in adulthood? Yes,
of any arthritis in the hip typically. So it's typically pain. It's often night pain. It might be pain related to certain activities. If there's a bit of bone that rubbing, you may find that it may be a specific movement that really catches. One of the most sensitive markers of hip problems is when you twist your hip inwards. So hips are obviously are often quite good at moving up and down, even if they're a funny shape. But it's rotation and twisting they don't like so much. So it's the twisting movements that might cause more problems. But it may not have been Perthes disease. It may have been DDH or SUFI or infection or something else.
Thank you, Dan. And one last question that has come in to conclude the webinar is whether, and we get this a lot, whether there are any links between hip dysplasia and Perthes disease.
So like I say, so DDH and so hip dysplasia. So Perthes disease is a condition where the blood supply to the top of the hip bone is lost, and it's lost because it's lost for a reason we don't know. In DDH, the blood supply to the hip can also be lost, so it also looks like Perthes disease, but it's often lost. So in DDH, usually the hip starts living up here, and we push it into the right place, so we squeeze it down into the socket. And as we squeeze it down into the socket, it basically squeezes and rinses the blood out of it, because the hip's been living up here for a couple of years, and then suddenly we move it down, and it's a bit unhappy. And because it's unhappy, it can similarly lose its blood vessels because they're too stretched. And so it creates a condition which is very much like Perthes disease. So it goes through similar changes. It doesn't tend to get the same pain as Perthes disease when it happens. I don't know why they should be different. So it's very so it is so that they kind of are related, but the pathology is different. So it happens for a reason, and it happens because the blood vessels are stretched. But of course, the hip bone does die, and it can change shape, and so it goes through a lot of the same process.
Thank you, Dan. And that concludes our webinar today. And for those of you that would like to submit questions, please do so. You can email them directly to STEPS Charity, info@steps-charity.org.uk. And also you're going to get an email there from me, and you can reply directly to me if you want to. Dan, thank you very much for your time. Much appreciated. And if there are any questions, we're more than happy also to submit them to Dan. And I believe, Dan, you're still recruiting for people for research.
So in terms of research, so the big studies that I want to get going. So we're not actively recruiting at the moment, but I'm actively looking for parents to help me answer them, because they're really tough questions, and they're tough for parents to decide that they're prepared to put their children in these big studies. So whilst the parents on the line today won't necessarily be able to get their children in the studies because they're probably a year or two away, they can really, really help me design them. So if anyone is keen to help, I'm keen to have them.
Perfect. And we will forward with your consent, the contact details to Dan.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. And again, Dan, appreciate your time and support. Thank you.